In the 1950s, one of the most popular shows on TV in the United States was the quiz show on NBC, You Bet Your Life.
It's Groucho Marx in You Bet Your Life.
The famous host has lost the exaggerated eyebrows and cigar of his earlier movies, but he's still the master of ad-lib and subversion. Being a guest on his show can change a career. Phyllis Diller, Ray Bradbury, even the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, Harlan Sanders, they all appeared on You Bet Your Life.
Here is the one, the only.
But in 1959, announcer George Fenneman called on perhaps the show's strangest guest.
Now, Groucho, I'd like you to meet Ferdinand Demara, who is better known as the Great Impostor. During his career, he has actually impersonated 30 different people. I'm sure
A tall, square-headed wall of a man walks out on stage. He surveys the stage from small, dark eyes. He easily dwarfs everyone around him.
Mr. Demara, put it there. Now, why aren't you in jail?
Well, I've never done anything completely wrong, Groucho.
I must say you're a very friendly fake, Fred.
The Great Impostor grins. Despite initial appearances, he is friendly, very friendly indeed. I'm Maria Konnikova, and this is The Grift, my podcast about con artists and the lives they ruin. We've heard about card sharks and psychics, art forgers and carnival cheats. But I've saved the strangest and perhaps most disturbing story for last. Ferdinand Demara's story is hard to tell, because for all the times he comes to the surface as himself, on national television, say, joking around with Groucho Marx, there are many more times that he disappears, becomes someone else. That's how he chose to live. But the results were not as amusing as Groucho might lead us to believe. Every once in a while, our culture becomes fascinated with imposters. You know Frank Abagnale? He's a former con artist played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can. So, Abagnale operated for 6 years and impersonated 8 people. Ferdinand, or as everyone calls him, Fred Demara, puts that to shame. Demara operated for at least 4 decades. He passed himself off as an engineer, Carl Shelby, a college dean, a cancer researcher, Dr. Cecil Boyd Hamann, a prison guard, a monk, many, many times a monk. He founded a college in Maine. He was a professor of psychology at Gannon College under the name Dr. Robert Linton French. He studied law. He became a hotel accountant. Ben Jones, if you must know. As Frank Kingston, he taught mentally retarded children, as they were then called. And as Martin Goddard, he taught rural school children in Maine and Alaska. And these are just a few of the identities we know of. There was hardly a moment in his life when he wasn't pretending to be someone else, and usually succeeding. Demara's most famous stunt had taken place a few years before he appeared on TV. He'd stolen the identity of someone named Dr. Joseph Sear and joined the Canadian Navy. Groucho Marx sounded a bit dubious about his guest's supposed exploits on You Bet Your Life.
How did you set yourself up as a surgeon on a warship?
Actually, I acquired these credentials, obtained a commission, and was sent to Korea as such.
You operated on people?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that rather dangerous?
You might say that.
Well, what did the other doctors think about you? Did they watch you operate?
Well, let me answer it this way. While we were in Halifax at the Royal Canadian Navy's headquarters, I gave seminars in internal medicine to the other doctors.
And they swallowed this?
Oh, yeah, the avid note-takers.
The arrogant confessional. It's the stuff so much great, or at least popular, television is made of. Demara, a high school dropout, is telling Groucho that not only did he lecture real doctors, but he actually operated on people without a medical license. He performed surgery without medical training of any kind whatsoever. Groucho seems desperate to make sure Demara has paid at least some price for his dangerous stunts.
Were you in jail in Canada?
No, no.
In the United States? Have you been in jail?
Yes, I have been in jail. I spent a year in the Texas State Penitentiary.
Well, it's about time.
Groucho turns to the audience for a second as he says this.
Somebody nailed you. What were you in there for?
I was in there as deputy warden.
Actually, he was assistant warden, but no matter. Demara's really saying he was able to fool the Texas State Penitentiary. Not the most lenient of correctional facilities in the world. He's no prisoner. He's the opposite. Demara is an incredibly successful imposter, and at the apex of his career here, smiling and laughing with a famous comedian on TV. What he doesn't say is that this fame is not to his personal credit. It's due to the one person he managed to take in for the longest period of time. The same person who thought he was exposing Demara to the world. His biographer. Whenever we hear about con artists, liars, crooks, imposters, we tend to think, I would never fall for that. But we do. Most of us, at some point, are taken in by someone who seems very charming at first, but who we later find out is plain toxic. And sometimes, for whatever reason, we let that person stay in our life. That is precisely what happened to Fred Demara's biographer, a man named Robert Crichton. And the story of how Demara conned his biographer arguably tops the list of his greatest accomplishments. When Crichton first heard Demara's story, he was a budding writer. He chanced upon a newspaper account of Demara's exploits, posing as the naval surgeon, the warden, and many others. Crichton was intrigued, to say the least. It's the mid-1950s. Crichton is married with 2 kids and another baby on the way. Money is tight. The family is broke, living in the West Village. And Crichton becomes a little obsessed with Demara's stories. Demara is compelling, he's fascinating, and he would make the perfect subject for Crichton's first book. Crichton tries to get an interview, but Demara keeps giving him the runaround. It seems that every time they're about to get together, something happens to thwart the meeting. Crichton comes to the appointed place at the appointed time, and he waits, and waits, and waits. Usually he stays for over an hour before giving up. He really wants this story. But Demara never shows. Or it seems he never shows. In reality, this is all a part of Demara's grand plan. He's watching Crichton at each of these rendezvous. He hides behind a plant in one hotel, a statue in one restaurant. He tells Crichton all this later. He's looking for not just any biographer, but the right biographer. And the right biographer is one who will keep showing up and keep waiting. A pliable type who is understanding and forgiving. The type who can be manipulated. Crichton, of course, knows none of this at the time. He thinks he's being stood up. He's about to give up and start thinking of another book subject, but just then, Demara reaches out. He tells Crichton that he's had a chance of a lifetime. What precisely remains unclear, but it's not strictly kosher, as Demara quickly says. And he's willing to give up the rights to his life story. He wants Crichton to have them. So at last, Crichton gets Demara to sign a contract at Random House. And he starts thinking about how he's going to write this book. He's a journalist by profession, so he assumes the natural way forward is through interviews. Demara begs to differ. Just as Crichton is getting ready to start digging into his background, he bails. He tells Crichton he doesn't want to do a book. He's changed his mind. But Crichton has been given the brush off one too many times, and this time he has a contract on his hands. So he decides to take a page out of the rogue playbook. When he's giving Demara a lift back to the hotel, he instead keeps right on driving out of the city. That's right. He decides to kidnap Demara, in a manner of speaking. If they are on the road together, Demara can't help but talk, especially if their itinerary consists of all the places where Demara had taken up false identities. And so they set out. One of their first stops is Kentucky, a Trappist monastery where Demara once posed as a monk. They don't linger. After Demara is recognized, the duo is forced to flee. You see, while he had been a monk there, he'd made off with more than credentials. Some cash and a car had gone mysteriously missing upon his leave-taking. Not everyone has fond memories of the Great Impostor. In Louisiana, they go to a revivalist tent meeting. Demara finds it next to impossible to resist. From his earliest childhood, he's always had religious leanings. And so at one point, he gets up on stage and starts cataloging his sins and preaching salvation to the crowd. It's a rousing success. In Tennessee, no one chases them for a change. It's an adventure and it's a bender. As Crichton soon learns, Demara has a bit of a problem with alcohol. It's not unusual to see him drinking a martini or two before breakfast. And that's just the warm-up light drinking. That trip becomes the basis for 2 books. Crichton's biography of Demara, The Great Impostor, is published in 1959. A follow-up, a memoir about the trip called The Rascal and the Road, comes out in 1961. That road trip is also the beginning of a long and complicated friendship. I didn't realize quite how complicated until I visited Robert Crichton's daughters, Sarah and Jen, in Jen's apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I wanted to learn what I could about their father and Demara. Both men had long since died, but I wanted to find someone who might share their memory, if only in part. Jen is there to greet me. Tall, blonde, energetic, and smiling, she seems excited to get started. 10 minutes later, Sarah arrives. She is older than Jen, more grounded. She has the same smile, the blonde hair, but shorter with neat bangs. I wonder if the smile is one they shared with their father. As Sarah makes tea, Jen departs to retrieve the materials they have on their dad. Jen comes upstairs with meticulously labeled files and boxes.
There's more downstairs, but this are probably the things that seem very obviously Great Impostor. Okay, so this is the payday. It's Fred Demara correspondence 1.
Wow.
2.
Oh my God.
Well
done, Jen.
She lays the boxes on the dining room table. Inside, there are reams of correspondence, clippings, letters, evidence.
All that organization after our mother died.
I know.
Oh, man.
And that should be enough to start.
That's amazing. I'll make some tea.
That afternoon, we sit in Jen's apartment, drink tea, dive into the boxes, and reminisce. The younger sister, Jen, doesn't remember Demara, but Sarah certainly does.
I remember, first of all, he was huge.
That's it.
I mean, that was part of the thing, is physically he was gigantic. And our father was very, very, very tall. But Fred was, big and loud. And, so that's also so interesting, because you always think of these con men as being able to sort of slide in.
Sarah also remembers how close Demara became with the family, how trusting her parents were, even when it came to their young daughters, even when they knew that Demara was a liar and con artist. Early in their friendship, they're on the road. Crichton's wife, Judy, is pregnant, and Demara actually manages to convince Crichton to let him, Demara, deliver the baby. Fire the Manhattan OBGYN. Let Demara take over. To us, this seems totally ludicrous, but somehow Crichton agrees. After all, Demara did okay as a surgeon in the Korean War. Judy is not amused. She refuses.
But even though she didn't like him, I do have this memory of, he took me when I was about 4 or 5 to one of my first movies.
Your father or Demara?
Demara.
Uh-huh.
And it was to one of those matinees. There used to be these matinees where children would go and there would be matrons. And he took me with flashlights. And he took me to see this movie called Darby Gill and the Little People, which is a movie with Sean Connery and leprechauns.
Really?
And
I said I'd visit your dreams, and when I make a promise, I keep it.
Not one of his classics.
Yeah, you don't hear that mentioned in the filmography.
And he kind of had a fight with the matron. Did not like this big giant man with all these little children. Like it was.
Were there other
grown-ups there? I don't
I think the whole point was you were supposed to be able to leave your child.
You would leave your child,
knowing that they would be safe.
Used to be in the old days in New York.
I see, and he went in with.
He went in with me.
I never heard that story. That does sound pretty creepy.
It's kind of creepy.
Judy didn't particularly like Demara, so why did she still let him babysit? Here's the story as Demara conveyed it to Crichton. Demara was born into a deeply religious Catholic family. They lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts, an industrial town in decline. But Demara's dad owned a chain of movie theaters, the Toomey and Demara Amusement Company. Demara's family has money. The result is that Demara becomes a bit of a snob. As a kid, he's wearing suits, he shines his shoes, and that's not the only reason he sticks out. He's also huge. He'll eventually grow to over 6 feet and more than 250 pounds. But even as a kid, he towers over his classmates. So he's kind of a pariah. His only friend is his older sister, Elaine. He's not the only one suffering. This is just about the time that the Great Depression hits, and the town is hit as hard as the rest of the country. His dad's business fails, and the family is forced to leave their big, beautiful house and move into what Demara thinks of as a hovel on the edge of town. Things go from bad to worse when Demara's beloved sister Elaine slips on a patch of ice and hits her head. She comes home dazed, lies down in bed, and never wakes up. So at the age of 16, after losing his sister and losing the comfortable lifestyle he'd been used to, Demara drops out of school and runs away to a Trappist monastery. You see, it's something he's always dreamed of doing, ever since he read that it's the toughest order of them all. No halfway measures for Demara. From the first, he only wants to associate with the best. Now, the Trappists don't fool around. They take vows of poverty, obedience, celibacy. They believe in the value of manual labor and spending long hours in contemplative silence. Demara spends 2 years there, and at the end of this ordeal, the monks decide that he's just not cut out to be one of them. He's known to sing and talk when he's meant to be silent, to sneak grapes when he's meant to be harvesting them, to sleep through early prayers when he's meant to be praying. This won't stop him from joining other orders later on, of course, and in future go-rounds leaving on terms of his own, sometimes with petty cash or vehicles in tow. Now, though, he is kicked out without any say of his own. Rejected and utterly alone, Demara laments. He leaves the monastery, and he will regret leaving it, this between actual sobs, for the rest of his life. The Trappists didn't work out, but could he have succeeded as somebody else, in another guise, another identity, another life? This is when Demara decides to try an experiment of sorts. He decides to borrow someone else's identity. Maybe if he can't succeed as Demara, he'll succeed as, Brother Marie Jerome, or Anthony Agnolia, or Carl Shelby. Crichton has spent months with Demara one-on-one. Demara is charismatic, he's persuasive, and he has a beautiful story of craving redemption, of things going wrong, but the real, true Demara wanting to do right, to come out from underneath it all, even if it takes time and effort. Crichton honestly believes that Demara is remorseful, that he can be reformed, even after all the lying, conning, and drinking. While he was writing The Great Impostor, Crichton found himself constantly doing favors for Demara, getting him out of pinches, footing the bill for various escapades. Of course, all those favors were essential to get Demara to cooperate while Crichton was writing the book, because it's not easy to get Demara to cooperate and keep cooperating. But it doesn't let up. After the break, how Demara went from being the subject of a lifetime to a subject that just wouldn't get out of his biographer's life. So back to our story. The Great Impostor becomes Crichton's first book, and it's quite the glamorized version of Demara's life. The first, more realistic draft was actually rejected by Random House. Demara wasn't enough of a hero. And while initially Crichton had reservations about changing too much, he came around after giving it some thought. Demara was sympathetic, and if you didn't know him and told the unvarnished story, you might not realize just how much good was in him. Crichton was an incredibly kind man. He saw the best in everyone, even in the worst of us. So Crichton polished Demara up, played up the glamour, played down the actual chicanery. And when The Great Impostor came out in 1959, it instantly became a bestseller. Crichton and Demara hit the media circuit. Newspapers, TV appearances. They even make it onto The Tonight Show. Fred Demara, The Great Impostor, becomes a household name. And for a while, he basks in the limelight. He even has a role in a real live Hollywood film.
The hypnotic eye. Terror loose in the city streets. A strange animal magnetism that drives women to do things hidden deep within their subconscious and bringing violence.
But once the paid media appearances dry up, Demara finds himself strapped for cash. As always. And now, since people know who he is, it's much tougher to go about business as usual. It's hard to pass yourself off as someone else when your face is all over the media. Meanwhile, Crichton's writing career has taken off. Universal Studios options The Great Impostor for a film adaptation. Demara is to be played by Tony Curtis.
Well, here's a fact, Major Turdell. Most of the guys I took the test with were college graduates with strings of degrees after their names, and I beat them. I beat them all. I tell you, Cindy, it just doesn't...
Once Demara sees that the film is taking off, he hires a Hollywood lawyer and sues Robert Crichton. That's right. He sues the man who has made him into a celebrity. At first, Crichton is furious. And he does what any writer does. He lets it all out on the page. He hammers out pages and pages detailing the favors he's done for Demara, the tabs he's picked up, the money he got Demara for all those media appearances. He's stood up for Demara. He's paid for his second chances. He's put his own name on the line for the sake of The Great Impostor. But he hasn't altogether forgotten all of the not-so-nice things Demara has done in return. Suing him, betraying others, lying, cheating, stealing. He writes, and I quote from his unpublished pages of angry ranting, that he has made a hero out of a bag of guts, and that he's more than prepared to let that bag of guts out into the world if need be. It doesn't look like Crichton ever sent this letter. What he did send was much milder. No threats to reveal whatever sins Demara was still hiding. Instead, he wishes him the best and sends his hopes that he's had a chance to calm down, to rest, to recover from the whole Hollywood thing. He even apologizes for this far milder harangue, as he calls it.
But at the same time, our father was soft-hearted, and
Oh, he was very
undoubtedly, Demara was able to work a lot of, operate on him pretty effectively.
And our father was the type of guy who would have believed that he was doing it out of good.
Legally, Crichton is completely in the right. But personally, he feels sorry for Demara. Even a little guilty. Because Crichton did get a good deal out of the story. He's made money and a name for himself. So Crichton tries to get Universal to pay Demara more. But they don't want anything to do with him, naturally. So Crichton hatches another plan. He doesn't actually have that much money to give to Demara. He's supporting a large family, and he's been making next to nothing for years. Even though the book sells well, the family is far from well off. So he starts writing his memoir, The Rascal in the Road, and he arranges for Demara to get some of the profits. Demara assures Crichton that he is out of the con game. He wants Crichton to believe that all of his efforts have been put to good use. Crichton has paid his way through an actual religious seminary, after all. Demara wants him to know he won't squander the chance. He moves to California and even begins to live under his own name. He starts a ranch for wayward boys to help others like the lost soul he once was. So he tells Crichton. And Crichton becomes Demara's champion. Over and over, he vouches for Demara, comes to his defense whenever he comes under fire. He writes him reference letters saying how trustworthy he is, how genuine is his passion for religion. He's a pretty remarkable person, Crichton tells anyone who will listen, and he is capable of remarkable work, when people trust him. It's not that Demara's a bad actor. It's that his life circumstances just didn't go quite as planned. Crichton can't help but help Demara. Crichton trusts him in spite of his better judgment. He desperately wants to believe that he can save the great impostor from himself. That is the power of the con artist's charm, his charisma, his allure, his hold over people. Back with Sarah and Jen, Robert Crichton's daughters, rifling through Crichton's old papers, I find a yellowed letter.
So that camp for boys that he said he was going to stay at for a while and that your father assumed he would. Yeah. So here's a letter from Robert Sheehan at the Sprague Electric Company. Several months ago on a local TV program, Mr. Demara stated that the great impostor no longer existed. He had found his mission in life. Last Monday night, it was announced that he had left without notice. The boys in the camp have been sent back to foster homes or to the camps for wayward boys once they came. His disappearance may be related to criticism of his beating of some of the boys and an overt implication of unnatural affection toward them.
Oh, wow! Wow.
Demara ran multiple schools for boys, and as Robert Sheen implies in that letter, there were rumors that Demara may have been a pedophile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think our mother at one point, she sort of implied, she once said something that, as I've been thinking, I've been trying to remember, because it wasn't like pederast, but it was close. It was basically...
I don't know. At the risk of killing the story, I think that's a possibility.
Or that was her fear, or that was,
Yeah.
you know...
And that's why I like the matron story. It's very creepy.
I know.
According to a local newspaper, Demara denied ever kissing any of the boys on the lips or fondling them. He said he tried to promote a father-son relationship and admitted holding them on his lap and kissing them on the cheek and forehead. The pederasty accusations cropped up a few times in different places, but the charges never stuck. Demara, like the best con artists, seemed made of Teflon. It didn't hurt that after Crichton's book and movie, he had prime Hollywood legal representation. Even after this episode, Crichton is still friends with Demara because there are no indictments, because Crichton can't be 100% sure that Demara had molested those boys. He can choose to ignore it, just as he'd chosen to excuse all of Demara's other bad behavior.
But I think it was a willing suspension of disbelief, in the sense that our father was very aware of grifter culture. He was not a rube. So, but what he was a great storyteller who loved a great story. So in a way, it's possible that he was complicit with Demara in seeing this is a tremendous story that he's creating. But how much our father totally bought into it is hard to say. But I am sure that he did con our father to a certain degree.
Well, if he kept asking for money, that's definitely...
Yeah.
Eventually, though, Crichton did give up on Demara.
I think the fact that Demara kept hitting him up for money in time, it's not just that it wore my father down, it kind of hurt his feelings.
Yeah.
He felt like he had been doing his best for this man.
And it didn't help. He realized finally that Demara would always be the great impostor. And that left Crichton a little brokenhearted. While fact-checking this story, I looked into the details of Demara's childhood. And remember his sister Elaine, whose death was a catalyst for Demara's dropping out of school, his drifting into a career as an impostor? Well, there's no evidence that she ever existed. We don't know if Fred Demara had any remorse for hurting people, ruining lives. I doubt it. He did it for too long, and he did it with far too much pleasure. Some might go so far as to call his behavior psychopathic, lacking in any conscience, in guilt, in empathy, in any of the emotions that might make another man balk at, say, conducting surgery without even a high school degree. Who knows? He might have been. It's unethical to give a diagnosis without ever having met the man. He certainly fits some of the criteria. But psychopath or no, Demara was definitely Machiavellian and narcissistic. Machiavellian in that he was able to manipulate so many people to do his bidding, and keep doing his bidding even when they knew him for the imposter he was. No one more so than Crichton. And Demara was narcissistic in thinking himself entitled to whatever he wanted. Degrees, jobs, opportunities. The true narcissist isn't just self-centered. His defining trait is the feeling that he deserves the world. And so he'll help himself to it. Out of all of the con artists I encountered, none had as many chances to go straight, so to speak, as Demara, and he squandered each and every one of them. Because at his core, I don't think he ever wanted to go straight. He didn't want an actual job. He wanted power over people, the power of deception, the power of knowing he was controlling your life. And he wanted it with the sheer gift of his personality, not with any hard work on his part. Here's the truth. He wasn't educated. He wasn't particularly talented at anything other than deception. When he went on Groucho's show, he couldn't actually answer elementary questions, like the definition of a homonym.
An opposite meaning.
Yeah. No, that's wrong.
No, I still think opposite.
That stint as a surgeon? Well, we know one thing, and one thing only. The one time he operated on Korean soldiers, no one died under the knife itself. But they were whisked off immediately after. Who knows how many of them died afterward? My guess is quite a few. After all, most of what Demara did was ply them with antibiotics and anesthesia. They couldn't complain because they were knocked out. Yet somehow, people like Crichton still believed in him and believed in his abilities. Demara was a master at manipulating others. But when it came to himself, he wasn't quite as able to exert control. To the end, he had a self-destructive streak. He died of heart disease and complications from diabetes in 1982. His doctor described him as the most miserable, unhappy man I've ever known. It makes a certain amount of sense. If you can no longer do the thing that gives you that rush, you lose yourself. It's like an addict who suddenly loses access to the substance that gives him pleasure. Miserable and unhappy seems about right. But here's what I want to add. I'm fairly certain his hundreds of victims ended up even more miserable in the end. Some of them probably ended up dead. Some perhaps molested by someone they trusted. The unvarnished truth? Underneath his glamour, Demara ruined lives. And we'll never know quite how deep his deceptions run. That is the true power of the grift. The Grift is produced by Adelia Rubin, Shoshi Shmulevitz, and Jacob Smith. Our editor is Julia Barton, and our fact-checker is Jen Schwartz. Ben Levin composed our music. Special thanks to Mia Lobel, Laura Mayer, and Andy Bowers.
The Pinna app has hours and hours of great ad-free audio for kids. Try the Pinna app for free. For more information, go to pinna.fm/listen.